Who is Mr Woofer? On this channel, I have been uploading videos with my own music as well as synthesizer demos for several years. But how many know who is the man behind Mr Woofer? What is my story? How did I get started and got involved with music? And how did my musical taste develop? So this is a mini documentary where I will unfold my relationship with music from a young age until today with the help of audiovisual material. The music that shaped me in my childhood and teenage years, the side projects I participated in, my relationship with synthesizers and electronic music. I hope you enjoy it. I was born in Athens, Greece. My mother was a pianist and singer, so I was in contact with music from a very young age. I started my first piano lessons when I was about 6 years old with my mother. But at some point I decided that maybe the piano was not the instrument I wanted to dedicate myself to. Luckily for me, my mother had a 7-inch record called The Orchestra that came with a book. There were presentations and musical excerpts from all the instruments of a classical orchestra. When I heard the cello, I was immediately enchanted by its sound, so I decided to start lessons at the music school at the age of 8. I eventually studied for several years and received classical training in the cello, but also in subjects such as music theory, solfège, music analysis, and many more. Later, I took part in the music school's orchestras and several chamber music concerts. The cello was definitely my favorite instrument, yet there were some pivotal points in my life that shaped my later musical tastes for good. Let's go back to the primary school years. My first recordings started in the mid-80s with two friends of mine, Yorgos and Orpheas, from primary school, with whom we started recording shows, which were nothing more than playback of music cassettes and our voices as imaginary radio DJs. We recorded with a microphone on a portable boombox-type cassette player of the time. But soon after that, something happened that left its mark on me. With my uncles, I generally had a very close relationship, and at the age of around 10, they jointly gave me an NAD record player, I hope I pronounced it correctly, with 3 vinyl records as a gift. They were my first vinyl records, 2 of which greatly influenced my later musical tastes. Those 2 records were the debut albums by the bands The Clash and Dead Kennedys, both punk rock bands whose music introduced me to punk rock culture. The second event of my childhood that influenced me musically was the following: a tape that my father brought home telling me that it was a strange atmospheric electronic music that he didn't understand too much, but he was already impressed with. The tape was Zuluk by Jean-Michel Jarre. Jean-Michel Jarre's music made such an impression on me that I soon acquired many of his tapes and records and later several of his albums on CD. 2 other friends of mine, Alexandros and Dimitris, were big fans of Jean-Michel Jarre at that time. With the latter, we discovered another band that influenced us a lot, Tangerine Dream. Somewhere around that time, the first music recordings began with my friends Dimitris, Nikiforos and Konstantinos. We recorded on a small tape recorder without actually rehearsing the tracks, which were mostly improvisations with whatever instruments we had available at the time, mostly my cello, the piano we had at home, Konstantinos' acoustic guitar and various improvised percussion. The period of adolescence continued with my participation in various bands that we created with friends, initially in a punk rock style. I either played electric bass or keyboards there, and sometimes did backing vocals. On other occasions, we recorded tracks with my friend Nikiforos in a more acoustic experimental direction. The recordings took place mainly in our homes, sometimes in studios, and very often we organized improvised mini-concerts for our friends.
I woke up and there's people for me to do. There are plenty of things I have to do. Let's go to the party, let's go to the party, drink and rock and dance, drink and rock and dance. It's been on board since the last time we fought. Mother miles apart. It burns too much to write about the loss.
One of the collaborations which influenced me a lot at the time was the band Mudflow. Mudflow's music was definitely in a different style than the rest of our bands, which, as we said, were mostly punk rock. Here, we were playing something like guitar-driven atmospheric shoegaze, later with ambient elements and even electronic instruments. Mudflow was originally formed by my friend Konstantinos, who played guitar, sang and wrote the tracks. Nikiforos played drums, and I was on the bass and sometimes backing vocals or keyboards. This project later evolved into a duo with Konstantinos and myself, where we went towards more electronic, ambient shoegaze paths, with the addition of more synthetic sounds that we recorded at my house. Those synthy sounds came from the first musical equipment I acquired at the time, which consisted of an Atari ST computer, a Roland A80 MIDI controller, and an EMU Proteus 1 Plus orchestral synth module. A little later, another synthesizer was added, the Korg X5. It was the time when I started to discover synthesizers. I imagined the studios of Jean-Michel Jarre and Vangelis that I saw in photos and videos of the time, and I wanted to own, too, such a studio. Of course, the machines I had at the time were far from that, but they were definitely a beginning and a first baptism. This led to a series of electronic experiments in my quest to create my own synthetic sounds and to learn music sequencing programs such as Cubase. Another popular hobby of the time, apart from the music bands, was the filming of various video projects, purely for our own enjoyment. Initially, we recorded meetings and gatherings of the group, where we did various pranks on the camera. Later, we shot a short, no-budget film with equipment of the time, like cameras with VHS tapes and video editing with 2 VCRs. Various humorous music video clips followed, as well as parodies of Greek TV series of the time and Greek cult films of the 80s. One of my uncles, who was very much into electronics, was a radio amateur himself, and he was building medium-wave radio transmitters. When he asked me if I would be interested in an old transmitter he had built, and he didn't need any more, I said yes, of course. Finally, another childhood dream of mine would come true. Instead of recording tapes of music pretending to be a radio DJ, I could actually literally go on the air. The transmitter had, of course, a very short range and was on AM, which hardly anyone listened to at the time, but who cared? So we got together with my friends Dimitris and Nikiforos. We collected all the vinyl records and cassettes we had. I also had an old garage record player and a Walkman in my room, and we started the shows. The repertoire included all kinds of music genres, from punk rock and hardcore to minimalism and Philip Glass, from electronic music to soul and funk. There was no lack of pranks and various minor accidents, as well as the reading of self-made funny texts, song dedications, and various jokes to friends who we knew were listening at the time.
Ακούτε εδώ πέρα θορύβους.
Έχω στα χέρια μου έναν πάπυρο του 15ου αιώνα, αγνώστου προέλευσης, ο οποίος λέγεται, αν δεν κάνω λάθος, Δάνκα.
Είναι κάτι το καταπληκτικό, δηλαδή είναι με ένα αυτό που ακούσαμε.
Another uncle of mine, Antonis, with whom we were to collaborate later, had a synthesizer that he didn't need at the time and asked me if I would like to borrow it. The synthesizer was a Kawai K3 that stayed in my room for several months. The sound was admittedly very beautiful. The user interface was, on the other hand, somewhat far from ideal. At that time, we must have been around 18 to 19 years old, and my friend Nikiforos and I were in a really creative estrus. We experimented with various video projects, some of which even included stop-motion animation, and later we started recording a trip-hop and ambient music project called Woofer. After a lot of audio dubbing on tapes, we recorded the result on a demo tape, which I happily presented to my uncle Antonis. Antonis is a notable musician himself, who at the time had an extensive record presence in collaboration with the independent record company Hitchhike. Antonis listened enthusiastically to the tape and suggested that we do the production for a CD in his personal studio. He had converted his basement into a studio space with soundproofing and good equipment, so the proposal was of course very tempting and interesting. He would even talk to Emilio, the director of Hitchhike, about a possible CD release with his company. Emilios immediately showed interest, so we got into the recording of the album. At that time, however, Nikiforos was called to serve in the army, which is mandatory in Greece. So the album was recorded by Antonis and me. It should be noted that Nikiforos had sung the lyrics on the demo tape, but due to his absence, I took over the lyrics myself for the album. 7 months later, and after the recording of the album had been completed, I was also called to serve in the army. Military service then lasted 18 months, a long pause. Fast forward a year and a half later, the two Woofer members were civilians again and could finally celebrate the release of their self-titled album, released by Hitchhike Records in 1999 during the military service. At that time, the album had already started to be played on the radio, and the favorite song of many music producers were Late Night Martini and TikTok. Professional photo shoots and radio interviews took place, with the most important on Epikinonia FM 94.1 and Rock FM 96.8, which also sponsored the album.
Να είμαστε λοιπόν εδώ σε 96,8. Ας καλησπερίσουμε λοιπόν τους δύο Woofer. Να ακούσουμε το Late Night Martini.
Late Night Martini. Late Night Martini. Oh, yeah.
Καλησπέρα παιδιά.
Καλησπέρα.
Ποιοι είναι μαζί μας σήμερα στο στούντιο?
Νικηφόρος και Κωνσταντής παρόντες.
Yeah. again, trying to get my head back.
There were also many album reviews published in various music magazines of the time, such as Pop and Rock, Difono, Ozon, Musiki, Oxy, and many others. Our mutual friend Alexandros took over as the webmaster of Woofer's first website. And then, the unexpected happened. Nikiforos decided to leave for studies in England, resulting in him also leaving the project Woofer. Of course, I wasn't determined to give up yet, and since music was, and still is, of great importance for me, I decided to continue as a solo artist under the name Mr Woofer. The project was now personal and the creative ideas were plenty. I soon began working on a number of new tracks with the prospect of them being released by Hitchhike as Mr Woofer, which in the end never materialized. After a long wait and a delay of several years, the company finally closed. At that time, digital distribution was not yet that widespread, so unfortunately it wasn't an option for me yet. On the other hand, I had the opportunity to experiment more and improve my compositional techniques. From these experiments came a large number of demo tapes, and some of these tracks were worked on again and again and eventually became the material for 2 albums that were released later. Besides, that was also the time when I started my studies in music, so my time was relatively limited. I studied cello and later advanced music theory, and after several years of hard study and work, I got my degree. After the end of my studies, I worked for the next few years as a member of various classical music orchestras and also as a session musician in cello recordings for several productions of modern music. But I didn't want to limit myself to that because my interest in music production and composition was still intense. So I also took on the production of contemporary music albums, mainly pop and rock. My most important collaboration at that time was for the production of Mary Dalakou's album titled Κόκκινες Μπογιές, which was also released by Hitchhike in 2002, shortly before it closed down for good. The album was an interesting mix of lyrical singing and electronic music with pop elements. I also collaborated extensively with Mary Dalakou in her live concerts, playing cello and singing. All this made me realize that I was more interested in composition and production than performance, and my desire to broaden my horizons led me to apply for postgraduate studies in the UK. I was accepted at the University of York, where I studied towards a Master of Arts in Music Technology. In addition to the various technical modules, there were several creative modules too, and it was a nice opportunity to restart my creative projects. Since I had my cello with me, I also participated extensively in the university's symphony orchestra. After finishing my studies, I was offered a place for a PhD in electronic music composition at the University of Surrey near London. My aim was to study part-time And at the same time, I was looking for a job in the music sector in the Greater London area. But the events that happened next made me eventually change course. So here, I think I'll take a break, because the first part of the Mr Woofer documentary comes to an end. Join me in the second and final part to discover the rest of the story, which covers the most recent period until the present day. See you then!